February 14, 1943. 1 in the afternoon, somewhere high above the endless blue of the Pacific. The air is thin, sharp, and trembling with tension. 20,000 feet below, the shattered jungle of Guadalcanal stretches like a dark, wounded beast. In the distance, the faint echo of gunfire rises and fades. Far above, a corsair slices through the sky. Its wings glint in the sunlight, its engine screams with raw power. Inside the cockpit sits First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, gripping the stick so tight his knuckles turn white. He rolls hard left, desperate to follow the small, agile shape of a Japanese Zero ahead of him. But the Zero turns inside his arc again. Its path is elegant, effortless, and mercilessly tight. Walsh pulls harder. 4 Gs, then 5, then 6. His vision narrows to a tunnel of gray. Blood drains from his head, and the edges of the world blur. The Corsair vibrates like a wild animal fighting its own strength. But no matter how hard he turns, the Zero cuts tighter, carving the air like a knife. Down below, his wingman's voice bursts through the radio, screaming for him to break away. But Walsh doesn't move. He knows if he breaks now, he'll die. The Zero will be on him in a heartbeat. He holds the turn, forcing the heavy aircraft through the impossible. For weeks, this scene has repeated itself across the Pacific. The Corsair, America's most advanced fighter, keeps losing when the fight slows down. On paper, it should dominate the skies. 2,000 horsepower, 650 caliber guns, faster than anything the Japanese can field. Yet in the real world, at low speed, it turns like a falling brick. The reports from the front are grim. In the first 30 days of Corsair combat, Marine pilots claim dozens of victories, but also suffer strange, needless losses. Zeros outturn them again and again, even when American pilots have the advantage. It isn't a problem of courage or training. It's a problem of physics. At lower altitudes, where fights tighten into desperate spirals, the Corsair's massive propeller becomes its own enemy. The torque from the engine pulls at the wings, twisting the plane against its pilot. Keeping level flight under G-forces feels like wrestling a bull midair. The machine is powerful but stubborn. It does not want to dance. By late February, the men of IMF 124, the first Corsair squadron in combat, are frustrated, exhausted, and scared. They write home about their strange, dangerous aircraft. They love its speed but fear its temper. Some begin to call it cursed. Their commanding officer, Major William Giese, sends reports to the engineers back home. The pilots can't maintain control in tight turns. They can't coordinate rudder and aileron without losing lift. Something is wrong with the design. But the answer from the States is cold and bureaucratic. All equipment functions within factory specification. No modifications authorized. So the war goes on. Pilots fly, fight, and die. Each time a Corsair falls in a slow turn, it's another reminder that America's most expensive weapon might be brilliant on paper, but broken in the sky. And yet, somewhere far from the engineers' offices and the white-tiled labs, 7,000 miles away, a young mechanic in a muddy tent watches the planes come back one by one, sometimes riddled with holes, sometimes not coming back at all. He isn't a scientist. He isn't a designer. But he listens. Soon, this quiet man, armed with nothing more than a wrench, a stubborn streak, and a dangerous idea, will break a rule that no one dares to touch. And when he does, everything about this war in the air will change. His name was James Patrick Nagle. To the men around him, he was just Jimmy, a quiet, grease-stained mechanic who worked harder than anyone else in the maintenance tents at Henderson Field. The tropical rain never stopped there. The air was thick with the smell of oil, salt, and burning avgas. Mosquitoes bit through uniforms, and the nights hummed with distant engines. Jimmy had no degree, no engineering background, and no claim to fame. He was a garage mechanic from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father owned a small repair shop, and Jimmy had spent his teenage years fixing transmissions and rebuilding carburetors. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, he enlisted without hesitation. The Marines asked what he could do, and he told them simply, "I fix engines." By February 1943, he had been on Guadalcanal for weeks, maintaining the Corsairs of VMF 124. His job was to keep the planes running, replace spark plugs, patch bullet holes, fix hydraulics, the unglamorous work that kept pilots alive. He wasn't known for brilliance. His training reports described him as adequate. But there was something in him that no manual could measure. He listened. After every mission, pilots would storm out of their cockpits cursing the Corsair. The same complaints echoed again and again. The nose dropped during turns. The rudder locked up. The plane fought back when it should have obeyed. Most mechanics nodded politely, wiped their hands, and went back to their tools. Jimmy asked questions. What did you feel right before it slipped? What speed were you holding? What did the stick do when the torque hit? One day, Lieutenant Howard Finn came back from a mission furious. The frustration poured out of him as he talked about the propeller, how it felt like it was working against him. The words stuck with Jimmy long after Finn walked away. That night, while the rest of the base slept, Jimmy sat alone under a flickering lantern with the Corsair's technical manual spread open on his workbench. He read about the Hamilton Standard Propeller Governor, a small, precise mechanism that controlled how the propeller blades twisted through the air. The system was designed to keep the engine within safe revolutions, adjusting blade pitch automatically. On paper, it was perfect, but it was also rigid. Its limits were locked by factory settings that no one was allowed to change. The manual was clear: unauthorized modification may result in catastrophic failure. Jimmy stared at that line for a long time. Then he thought of Finn's voice, of the pilots who hadn't made it back, and of the empty bunks in the tent behind him. Maybe, he thought, perfect on paper wasn't good enough. He began to study the system in detail. The fine pitch stop, a small brass screw deep within the governor, set the lowest angle the blades could reach. It was tuned for balance, meant to serve every flight condition from takeoff to landing. But combat wasn't about balance. In battle, the pilots needed all their power focused into one thing: turning tight and surviving. Jimmy realized something the engineers never could from behind their desks. If he could let the blades flatten just a little more at low speed, they'd bite into the air differently, creating more thrust for tighter turns. It would be risky. The engine might overspeed during takeoff. The propeller could fail. But if it worked, it might give the pilots the edge they needed. At 3 a.m, in the damp heat of the maintenance tent, Jimmy made his decision. He took a spare governor off a Corsair, set it on the bench, and opened the housing. Tiny springs and pistons glinted in the lamplight. He adjusted the fine pitch stop a fraction of a turn, just enough to change the angle by less than 2 degrees. By the book, it was an act of sabotage. In truth, it was the beginning of something that would rewrite the history of aerial combat. As the dawn broke over Guadalcanal, the engines began to warm up for the morning patrols. No one noticed the quiet mechanic wiping the oil from his hands, staring at the plane that now carried his forbidden modification. Tomorrow it would fly, and the world would find out whether he had saved his friends or doomed them. The next morning began with the smell of wet earth and aviation fuel. Dawn light spilled over the airstrip at Henderson Field, painting the scattered clouds in pale orange. Mechanics moved like shadows through the fog, preparing the Corsairs for another day of war. None of them knew that one of those planes carried something forbidden, a modification that could change everything. Jimmy Nagle stood beside the aircraft he had worked on all night, his eyes heavy but alert. He had turned a screw barely more than the width of a fingernail, yet that tiny act had broken Navy law. As the sun rose, he tried not to imagine the worst. If his calculations were wrong, the propeller could overspeed and tear itself apart. The engine could explode. And the pilot, Lieutenant Howard Finn, would not survive. When Finn climbed into the cockpit for his test flight, Jimmy said nothing. The engine roared to life, deep and thunderous, sending ripples through the humid air. Jimmy listened to the rhythm, searching for any sign of imbalance. None came. The Corsair taxied down the strip, lifted its nose, and clawed its way into the sky. Minutes passed like hours. Every sound of distant engines made Jimmy tense. He stared at the horizon, waiting for the black smoke of failure or the shining wings of success. When the Corsair finally appeared again, banking low and steady, he exhaled for the first time in 10 minutes. Finn climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit damp with sweat, his face unreadable. Then he nodded once. The plane, he said, handled differently, smoother, lighter in the turn, the torque easier to fight. It felt alive in his hands. Jimmy didn't celebrate. He only asked if it was safe. Finn said it was better than safe. It was right. By the next morning, word had spread. One plane had flown better, and now everyone wanted the same magic. Jimmy began modifying more propeller governors in secret, one by one, late at night under a kerosene lamp. 12 aircraft in total. Each adjustment was measured, tested, reassembled. He worked with the quiet focus of a man who knew he was risking everything. It couldn't stay secret forever. During a maintenance inspection, Major William Giese found out. The commander's temper ignited like fuel. He demanded to know who authorized the changes, who had dared to alter the Corsair's flight systems. Jimmy stepped forward and admitted it was him. In that moment, the tent went silent. Giese's anger collided with something deeper, curiosity. Jimmy explained what he had done, why he had done it, and how it had changed the aircraft's balance. The engineers called it reckless, dangerous, unscientific. But Lieutenant Finn stood beside him and said he had flown it. The change was real. The argument grew heated. Regulations said it was illegal. Common sense said it was madness. But war rarely leaves room for rules. Finally, Giese made his decision. They would test it. 2 Corsairs would fly side by side. One standard, one modified, under identical conditions. If Jimmy's theory failed, he would face court-martial. If it worked, he would have rewritten the book on combat flight. The following morning, the test began. The 2 aircraft climbed through the humid air, engines howling. Major Giese watched from the control tower, stopwatch in hand. At 10,000 feet, both Corsairs began turning maneuvers. From the ground, it looked like a slow ballet between giants. But within seconds, the truth became clear. The modified Corsair turned tighter. It held coordination longer. It completed full circles faster by nearly 50 feet of radius. The difference was not illusion. It was undeniable. When the planes landed, Giese turned to his officers. No one spoke. He simply gave the order. Every Corsair in the squadron would be modified within 24 hours. That day, Jimmy Nagle didn't smile or boast. He only nodded and went back to work, wiping the sweat and oil from his hands. He knew this was only the beginning. The Pacific skies would soon tell the rest of the story. The news spread quickly across the Pacific like a rumor carried by wind. The Corsairs of IMF 124 were suddenly flying differently. They were lighter on the stick, steadier in turns, and no longer lost control when the air slowed around them. Pilots who had once cursed their aircraft now felt something strange, confidence. But back in the world of polished offices and official stamps, confidence wasn't enough. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, thousands of miles away, learned of the modifications and responded with the language of bureaucracy: cease operations immediately. Their telegram was clear. Unauthorized changes to propeller governors violated standing directives. All modified aircraft were to be grounded at once. For Major William Giese, that order meant nothing. He had seen the difference with his own eyes. His men were flying better, fighting better, and coming home alive. He sent his reply in a short message: combat operations continue. What followed was a storm of telegrams, memos, and angry engineers. They argued that Jimmy Nagle's changes could cause catastrophic overspeed, that the Corsairs might destroy themselves mid-flight. Giese pushed back. He had the data, the test results, and the pilot's testimony. Every number showed improvement. Every flight proved survival. Still, Washington demanded proof from someone they trusted. A Navy test pilot, trained and credentialed, not a mechanic from Pittsburgh. That man was Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn. He was an engineer before the war, calm, precise, and respected by everyone who wore wings. When he arrived on Guadalcanal in March 1943, the airfield buzzed with nervous anticipation. Blackburn walked across the muddy strip, shook Giese's hand, and examined one of the modified Corsairs himself. He studied the governor housing, the small brass screw, the faint tool marks that told a story of defiance. Then, without fanfare, he climbed into the cockpit. For 6 hours that day, Blackburn flew both versions, the factory standard and the forbidden. He tested climbs, dives, and high G turns. He pushed each to its limits, recording data on every movement, every vibration. When he finally landed, the sun was low, and the men gathered around, waiting for his judgment. His written report arrived the next morning. It was brief, but it changed everything. Blackburn called Nagel's adjustment empirical field engineering of the highest order. The modified fine-pitch setting, he wrote, improved low-speed maneuverability without compromising safety or high-speed performance. His final line sealed it: recommend immediate fleet-wide adoption. The Bureau of Aeronautics had no choice. On March 14, 1943, they approved the modification across all Corsair squadrons in the Pacific. The brass screw that once broke every regulation now became standard issue. By then, the VINF 124 was already proving its worth in the sky. The pilots no longer feared the slow turns. They no longer lost fights they should have won. The Corsair had finally become what it was meant to be, the deadliest machine in the air. Yet, Jimmy Nagle never celebrated. He didn't see himself as a hero or an inventor. He saw himself as a mechanic who fixed what was broken. He still worked long nights, still wiped his hands with the same rag, still stayed quiet when others talked about glory. The change he had made was small, just 1 7/10 of a degree, but it had shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. And soon, that change would be tested in the one place that cared nothing for numbers or approvals: combat. February 28, 1943. The humid air above Bougainville shimmered with heat and the metallic hum of engines. 8 Corsairs, freshly modified with Jimmy Nagle's adjustment, climbed into the sunlight. They flew in formation, their dark blue wings catching the glare as they rose to escort a group of dauntless dive bombers toward Japanese positions at Kahili. Leading the flight was First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh. He had been there in the early days, when the Corsair was a beast that refused to obey. He remembered the fear of losing control in every tight turn, the helplessness of watching Zeros slice through the air like silver blades. But now, as he eased his plane into a climb, something felt different. The controls were lighter. The torque that once fought him now yielded, smooth and predictable. At 1400 hours, the call came through the radio. Bandits, 6 at 3 o'clock high. 6 Zeros, gliding in formation, sunlight flashing off their wings. They were already diving. Walsh ordered his squadron to break and turn into the attack. The sky erupted into chaos. Walsh pulled hard to the right. The Corsair responded instantly. The nose came around cleanly, the wings held steady. For the first time in months, he wasn't fighting the aircraft, he was flying it. A Zero tried to cut inside his turn, but Walsh matched it, holding the radius tighter and tighter until the enemy pilot overshot. In that moment, the impossible happened. The heavy Corsair stayed with the Zero, turn for turn, a perfect spiral of power and precision. Walsh fired, the 6 machine guns roaring together. The Zero's engine exploded in a flash of fire and smoke. Walsh rolled out of the turn, scanning for another target. Seconds later, a second Zero dove from above. Walsh inverted, pulled through, and turned again. The G-forces pressed him deep into his seat, but the plane held together, steady and obedient. The Zero tried to climb out of the circle, but the Corsair stayed close, its propeller biting the air with a fierce, mechanical rhythm. Walsh fired again. Another burst, another explosion. 2 kills in one mission, both from turning engagements. Something no Corsair pilot had ever done before. When Walsh returned to Henderson Field, the ground crew gathered as he taxied in. He shut down the engine and sat in silence for a full minute, the propellers slowing to stillness. Then he climbed out and saw Jimmy waiting near the wing, grease still on his hands. Walsh said nothing at first. He simply extended his hand. Jimmy shook it, and the look between them said everything words couldn't. Over the next 3 months, the results spoke louder than any report. VMF 124 scored 342 aerial victories with 67 losses, a kill ratio of 22-1. Other squadrons flying unmodified Corsairs recorded far less. The difference was undeniable. Japanese intelligence soon noticed as well. Captured reports described American fighters displaying improved low-speed maneuverability. The old tactic of baiting them into slow turns no longer worked. Pilots were ordered to avoid prolonged dogfights and rely on speed instead. Even the legendary Japanese ace Saburo Sakai wrote in his diary that the Americans had changed. The Corsairs could now turn nearly as well as the Zeros but hit much harder. Their advantage was fading fast. By the summer of 1943, Nagel's forbidden adjustment had become part of every new Corsair that left the factory. The official production documents listed the setting at 21.8 degrees of fine pitch, with no mention of who had discovered it. Somewhere, thousands of feet above the Pacific, pilots who had never heard of Jimmy Nagle were surviving because of a change smaller than a thumbnail twist of metal. And while others celebrated the Corsair's triumph, Jimmy stayed at his workbench, just another mechanic doing his job. He didn't need medals or speeches. His reward was the sound of engines roaring to life each dawn, proof that his planes and his men were still flying. By mid-1943, the Pacific skies belonged to the Corsair. The once troubled fighter had become a predator. Its pilots no longer feared the slow turns that had once spelled death. Now, when Japanese fighters dove into combat, they found an American machine that could twist and claw through the air almost as tightly as a Zero but carried far more firepower. The statistics told the story. In just a few months, the Corsair's kill ratio climbed to 11-1. Across the islands, from Bougainville to Rabaul, squadrons flew with newfound confidence. The same plane that had been called unmanageable now earned a new name whispered among the Japanese, Shino Fukia, the death whistle. Its roar filled the sky before it struck, a sound that chilled even veteran pilots. But far below the dogfights and glory, Jimmy Nagle still worked in the same muddy tent at Henderson Field. He was the same quiet mechanic with oil-blackened hands and eyes that carried too many sleepless nights. When people congratulated him, he brushed it aside. To him, it was an invention. It was repair. He had fixed a flaw that had cost lives. That was all. As new Corsairs arrived from the factories with his modification built in, Jimmy simply nodded and went back to his work. No one wrote his name in the manuals. No officer pinned a medal to his chest. He didn't ask for one. Recognition was never the point. The war moved fast. Each day brought new missions, new pilots, new faces. Some returned. Some didn't. But fewer were dying now, and that meant something. In the long stretches of night, when the airfield was silent except for the ocean wind, Jimmy would walk past the rows of Corsairs sleeping under their tarps and touch the cool metal of their noses. He would think of the men who had flown them, of those who hadn't come back, and of how close he had come to being wrong. By 1944, his adjustment had spread to every Corsair squadron in the Pacific. Thousands of aircraft carried his fingerprint, a subtle twist of metal that had shifted the balance of the air war. The Navy engineers finally included the new fine-pitch setting in production under a technical revision number, nothing more. The small brass screw that had once broken regulations now sat inside every propeller as if it had always belonged there. When the war ended in 1945, the Corsair stood as a symbol of dominance. Over 12,000 had been built. It was credited with more than 2,400 aerial victories and had the lowest loss rate of any American fighter in the Pacific. The newspapers called it the machine that won the air war. But no headline mentioned the mechanic from Pittsburgh. Jimmy went home quietly. He reopened his father's garage on a small street lined with elm trees. He fixed cars again, the same way he had before the war. He changed oil, replaced fan belts, and never talked about the Corsair. When local reporters tried to interview him years later, he told them he just did his job. The propeller governor that had changed history was lost forever when Lieutenant Finn's Corsair was shot down over Rabaul. It sank into the deep Pacific, buried beneath miles of saltwater and silence. But the change it carried lived on, not just in the aircraft, but in the minds of every pilot who had survived because of it. At reunions years later, the pilots of VMF 124 would speak his name with quiet gratitude. Some called him a hero. Jimmy never agreed. To him, heroes were the men who flew, who faced the tracers and fire. He was only the man who made sure their planes worked the way they should. He never asked for a plaque, but one found its way to him anyway, a simple wooden board engraved with the words, "To Technical Sergeant James Nagle, whose courage to question authority saved lives and changed the course of the war. He hung it in the back office of his garage, away from the customers, where only he could see it. Years passed, and his story faded into memory. But in the Marine Corps Aviation Museum in Quantico, there is a small display about the Corsair's development. Among the technical notes and engine diagrams, one line appears in tiny print: field adjustment pioneered by Technical Sergeant James P. Nagle, United States Marine Corps, 1943. It is quiet recognition for a man who never wanted any. The engineers once said it was impossible. The regulations said it was illegal. But Jimmy Nagle proved that sometimes the right kind of defiance can change the world. Years after the guns fell silent and the Corsairs were retired to museums and memory, the world moved on. Jet engines replaced propellers. Radar replaced instinct. The skies became quieter, faster, and colder. But hidden in the lessons of those early days was something that never faded: the proof that a single act of courage, born in the mud and sweat of a mechanic's tent, could echo across generations of flight. By the 1950s, young engineers studying at aeronautical schools were taught about variable pitch propellers. They learned the theory behind adjusting blade angles for performance, efficiency, and control. What most of them didn't know was that one of those critical principles, tuning pitch for specific flight conditions rather than a general compromise, had been discovered by a man who never finished high school. Boeing engineers later included Nagle's work as a case study in propulsion courses. It wasn't celebrated for complexity but for simplicity. A single screw turned by a few degrees had redefined how aircraft could perform at the edge of physics. That quiet lesson became a cornerstone of modern aviation, that the best engineering doesn't always come from equations but from the courage to question assumptions. In Pittsburgh, Jimmy kept living his quiet life. He grew older, his hands roughened by years of work, his eyes still steady behind smudged glasses. The war seemed far away, almost like a dream half forgotten. Sometimes, when a plane passed overhead, he would look up for a moment, then return to his tools. He didn't see himself as part of history. He was just doing what he had always done, fixing what was broken. In 1978, decades after the battles had ended, a reunion of Corsair pilots was held in Pittsburgh. They tracked Jimmy down and visited his small garage. Among them was Colonel Kenneth Walsh, now retired, his chest carrying the Medal of Honor. When he walked in, Jimmy barely recognized him. Walsh smiled and said softly, "Jimmy, you already helped me once." That year, 57 former Corsair pilots gathered to honor the man whose defiance had saved them. They presented him with a plaque, simple and direct, to Technical Sergeant James Nagle, whose unauthorized ingenuity and willingness to break rules saved lives, won battles, and proved that the best engineering sometimes comes from those with the courage to question authority. Jimmy hung it in the back of the shop, behind a shelf stacked with oil cans. He never mentioned it to customers. It wasn't pride that kept him silent, it was humility. When he passed away in 1993 at the age of 73, his obituary was only 3 sentences long. It mentioned that he was a veteran, that he had served in the Marine Corps, and that he had returned to Pittsburgh to run a repair shop. There was no mention of the Corsair, no hint of the legacy he left behind. But his name didn't vanish. Somewhere, deep inside the archives of flight history, in engineering manuals and museum panels, a small note remains. A footnote for most, a legend for a few. Field adjustment pioneered by Technical Sergeant James P. Nagle, United States Marine Corps, 1943. Modern fighter planes no longer have propeller governors, but the philosophy lives on in every jet that slices the sky. It is the idea that machines must serve the people who fly them, not the other way around. That the best solutions often come not from those who follow every rule, but from those who care enough to break one. And so, long after his tools were put away, Jimmy Nagle's touch still lingers in the air. In every cockpit that answers precisely when a pilot pulls the stick. In every aircraft that performs just a little better because someone dared to ask why not. Some heroes fight battles. Some build the weapons that win them. And some, like Jimmy Nagle, simply turn a wrench and change the course of history.